Thank you, Prasanna, for the opportunity. Thank you, Bethany, for a great talk. So to begin, before I begin going deep into the notebook, I'll start by just reiterating a small part of what Bethany talked about. The process of capturing uncertainty is composed of basically a few steps. The first step is we are trying to take the data and uh, fit a catalog of models for which we will leverage our DeepHyper's neural architecture search as well as hyperparameter search to fit a catalog of models. Then leveraging this catalog of models, we use greedy Caruana method to come up with a small group of models, which is comprised together to give us our ensemble. Then we use this ensemble to gather predictions of both the uncertainty and the predictions of future temperature on the same data set that we have been working with since this morning. So the first few steps, and obviously, because the NAS part, the hyperparameter search and the neural architecture search parts takes too long, I have already pre-run this notebook, so I'm not going to run these cells independently right now. I'll just walk you through the steps that we have been following to get to the results and how these results can be interpreted. So to begin, basically the first step is to install all the required packages that requires installing, which can be observed by running the cell. And this is something I'm reiterating from the last two sessions we had, is that once you have installed it fully, restart the runtime. And if even after restarting the runtime you get some errors, just please go ahead and use the function over here, runtime, go down and say restart runtime a few times just to make sure everything is working right. Another key thing to remember here is that please do not use this run all. The Collab has a way of trying to execute cells parallelly, and because these are all sequential, the notebook is structured sequentially, the parallel executions of different cells is not going to work very well. So please do not execute run all or run all the cells together. It will throw you errors, so the best way is to go one by one in observing waiting for the output to come and then executing the next cell. Now, once you have installed all the required packages, which requires you to download the data and all the DeepHyper based packages. You include all those packages in your memory by executing the second cell. Once we have gone through that, and we have gone through setting up whether you are using a GPU or a TPU or everything, following the previous two sessions, you download the data. The data is again a combination of time step latitude and longitude. And I think Ramit explained it very nicely about what these three numbers here mean in terms of domain-based understanding of it. Once you take that data and you visualize the temperatures across the planet, this is how the temperature looks. For this type of data set, we are now going to set up one model, which is our baseline model on which we are going to run our neural architecture search and everything. So this baseline model is a little different from the baseline models that we were constructed before in the previous two sessions. The key difference here is the introduction of this distribution lambda, this TensorFlow probability layer. This TensorFlow probability layer basically says that now a model basically has two outputs. One is the mean and one is the variance. So these are the two, location and the scale are the two outputs that the model is going to predict. And based on this location and scale, we are going to calculate negative log likelihood, which is what we are going to minimize. So instead of minimizing the mean square error, which was what done before, when the requirement of uncertainty was not included into the picture, we were using the output was directly compared to the prediction. The prediction was directly compared to the ground truth, and we were minimizing the mean square error. But now we are going to work in terms of probabilities. Therefore, we have a mean and standard deviation prediction, and the loss function that we are going to use will be negative log likelihood instead of your standard mean square error. And negative log likelihood basically in this context is your y transpose log probability of the ground truth transfer log probability of what is predicted by the network, and that's what this function here. So the key difference between the previous two models and this model is the introduction of the variational layer, which predicts mean and standard deviation. Now, once we have built this model, once we have executed this cell, we can go ahead and visualize this model, which basically is one LSTM. So we are all familiar with these three steps here, which was there in the previous two sessions. The only step that gets added is this one, in which you are predicting mean as well as standard deviation. This one has about 69,000 parameters, and then when you run through 20 epochs of this, the loss nicely goes down, the validation loss goes down as well. For a baseline model, if we visualize the negative log likelihood with respect to number of epochs, we say that the learning is happening nicely and the losses are going down very nice, both in training and in terms of validation loss. And we will show that after that ensemble is being created and the NAS and hyperparameter searches are run, this output of the model in terms of the loss curve actually improves drastically. So once this baseline model has been learned, we can use PCA and some min-max transformation to visualize this model. When you visualize this model, this is the original ground truth and the predicted and some absolute error. Obviously, in these coastal areas, the absolute error is a little bit large, but by and far, the baseline model predicts reasonably, not exceptionally bad, which is highlighted by these metrics here, which is train, test, and validation. Our metric mean square error is exceptionally very low. So now we get to the main meat of the problem here. So the key difference between, so in the previous session with Romit, we talked about neural architecture search, and the session before with Roma, we talked about hyperparameter search. In this hands-on, we are going to put together the neural architecture search and hyperparameter search to run our DeepHyper in a full scale, and we're going to use edge-bow search to run this. So how does this differ? How does the code? What changes are required to be made to the code? So the most of the code with respect to the hyperparameter, the neural architecture search is similar to what was shown by Romit earlier. The key difference being is that this part here is added. So because our model now has a variational layer at the output, you add that variational layer into the search into the neural architecture problem, and the rest of the setup remains the same. Now, when we are setting up our architecture, once this architecture class is set up, we can look at the different kinds of randomly sample a few architectures that can be searched in the process of our neural architecture search using DeepHyper. These are the few architectures that are visible, that are produced by the architecture search, and you see that these architectures are distinctly different from each other. And the more distinct the architecture, the more wider the search space is, and you have more possibility of coming up with better architectures, which will improve your accuracy of the problem. So when you do that, we come to after executing that cell, we come to cell number 17, where we set up our problem of neural architecture search along with the hyperparameter search. And how we do that? The first step, these two problems, is just using the DeepHyper.problem and setting up the problem and loading the data. Once you load the data, you add the neural architecture search space, which was defined by our class. We defined in cell 15, and we set that search space to be together. Now the key difference comes. While in the code that Romit showed in the same setup, these hyperparameters here were fixed. Now these hyperparameters here are written as a search space, similar to what Roma showed in the first session. So look at that. So the batch size is searched between 2 and 24, while the starting value is about 64. The learning rate is searched between 1.1 10 to the power negative 5 to 10 to the power negative 2, while the default value is 10 to the power negative 3, and optimizers, the different optimizers are being searched. So we had a question in Slack earlier about whether the different optimizers can be searched or not, and the answer to that is yes, which was answered there. And this is how you do it. Basically, you had a problem, a hyperparameter, which is basically a list of all the optimizers which you are going to search across, and internally DeepHyper will convert this into an integer optimization space, where this will be 0, this will be 1, this will be 2, and this will be 3, and search through it to give you what is the best optimizer for this problem. And then a starting point for that is Adam, which is also being searched here. Now, beyond these hyperparameters that are going to be searched by the DeepHyper's HPS, we also have some number of epochs, which is fixed in this case. Previously, this number of epochs was also searched in the first session, but in this case, we fix it. And then we add this, we also add some early stopping criterion and model checkpoint. The model checkpoint thing becomes really important in the case of our uncertainty ensemble, creating of an ensemble, because based on this model checkpoints, we are going to use these model checkpoints in part of our ensemble creation process, which I will show later. So this needs to be this is very important, becomes very important in this case. Now, for the loss function, instead of the mean square error, which was being used before, as I mentioned, we're going to replace it with an LL, because my network output is now mean and standard deviation. I'm going to assume that this mean and standard deviation are for a Gaussian distribution, and apply the negative log likelihood on that, and which is what going to give me my objective. And so once you execute this cell, we have this objective to be validation loss, which is, of course, the loss function is calculated on the validation data, which is what we are going to minimize. And training is so each time a configuration is searched, we are going to use the training data to train it. And once the training is finished, we are going to use the validation data to calculate the validation loss. And based on that, the third search problem is going to be executed. Now, the search problem here is based on HBO, which is aging evolution plus Bayesian optimization. This HBO is going to focus more on exploiting the different hyperparameters, but focus more on coming up with the exploration of hyperparameters is less, whereas the exploration on the architecture side is more, and that's what this is going to do. And we're going to run this for about 30 evaluations. Now, I have this part is the one that takes the longest time to learn. In this case, it ran up for about 1 hour before it was able to give me all the evaluations for the 30 models that I was looking for. Once this, so I have pre-run it, and the results from that model can be visualized as before. Now, the first step here is the architecture sequence. So the architecture sequence is given as a list, which list of integers, which makes our search problem with the aging evolution actually pretty nice to use with. So there is a batch size that we got our best learning rate. The best optimizer is Adam, and the objective that is going to give is this, and that's the timestamp, the amount of time it took to gather these things. Now, in the previous two cases, we would have thrown off all the other 29 models that this searched, and only kept the first model. But in these cases, our goal is to come up with an ensemble which is going to be able to give us an uncertainty estimate through this mean and standard deviation. And that's why we are not going to throw all of these models away, but rather keep all of them and come up with the best subset of this catalog. This is what we call as catalog. All these 30 models is the catalog. And we are going to come up with the best subset of this catalog, which can give us the most best accuracy on the problem. And a side effect of that would be a combined uncertainty on the model itself, which is an ensemble uncertainty through this setup. So if we do come and visualize the best model that was provided by our NAS and HPS, we observe that this is kind of a very complicated model that it come up with. But the key thing here is that when this model is used to train, and we visualize the training, the loss over the number of training epochs, we observe that this loss is actually much better than the blue one, which was the case in which of the baseline model, when the baseline model was trained using this. So we observed a much better response function, response of the loss function over the baseline model, and this improvement is purely due to the use of DeepHyper's hyperparameter search as well as neural architecture search. So now we can use the best model and we can use the best model and kind of visualize the output itself, the best model. Now, because the model's output is mean and standard deviation, we have a natural estimate of uncertainty that comes because of it. This means with the assumption that you're using negative log likelihood to estimate this uncertainty. So once this is done, we can see that the metric scores. Now, here is where I bring you to this idea of looking at this metric R-square values. Now, observe that the test R-square value is about 0.78. In the previous case, in the baseline model case, although the training was happening very well, the value of the R-square was actually pretty bad in terms of negative values. But in this case, the R-square value has actually improved drastically, and then this is because of the case. Okay, so once we have this catalog of models that we have trained, we're going to use UQ ensemble. We can create an ensemble. Now, creating an ensemble basically requires you to execute this cell. We define array. We utilize the array's capacity to run these ensemble evaluations in parallel, and then this one command allows you to set this up. This is the bagging ensemble. All the models that were saved saved according to our all the models that were obtained through our search of neural architecture and hyperparameter are saved in this directory. Again, the default loss that is going to be minimized. So over this selection of this ensemble is an LL. The number of ensembles that we are seeking is 5. And then the process selection process is greedy Caruana. We basically go through validation. We use the validation data to fit this ensemble, and then go through and then select these members. So now, once this ensemble is selected, we can predict the ensemble, predict the estimation, or rather the mean prediction that is provided by the ensemble. We predict the UQ Eleatric uncertainty and the epistemic uncertainty. The prediction of epistemic and Eleatric uncertainty separately comes because of the decomposition, which was shown earlier in the presentation. Decomposition allows us to evaluate both Eleatric and epistemic from the same ensemble due to say separate components that come out of that equation directly. Once we try to visualize it using this by executing this cell, we see that we have quite good prediction in terms of ensemble prediction. We have the absolute error. We can get the Eleatric uncertainty and we can get the epistemic uncertainty. All of them are observed separately. So this basically is what you obtain. Again, the Eleatric uncertainty near these coasts here is actually a little not as good as you would expect, but the epistemic uncertainty is actually pretty good. Now, when you get to your when you take the ensemble and evaluate the metric mean square error and the metric R square error, we observe that both of them go down. Now, this went from negative R square values to 0.78 in terms of just the ensemble, just to the best model, and that went to about 0.88 in terms of the ensemble. So creating the ensemble in this way, leveraging the different models that have been obtained by neural architecture and hyperparameter search, allows us to not only get a quantification of uncertainty, but also lets us improve our overall scores on the data itself. As Prasanna mentioned, that this allows us to get a much better source of uncertainty, as well as a better improvement in terms of the scores itself. That's basically what I have for this notebook. I can take any questions you might have now.
Hey, thanks, Krishnan and Bethany. This is great. Time for questions. So we are also going to have a break, sort of a lunch break, and some of us, or subset of us, will be here to answer questions related to the 3 topics that we had so far. So please use Slack. That's a preferred way so that we can keep track of the questions and put that in a FAQ after the workshop. But if you cannot access Slack, then please feel free to use Zoom as well. So there are several questions in the chat. Maybe it will be useful to discuss that with everyone. So can we go or select some of them and discuss here? I will go in the reverse chronological order. Can we use the Egel? I think I saw your first name, but I'm not seeing that in the Slack. Could you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, the first name is Aytekin. Sorry, the Slack is
okay.
still in an abbreviated way. So I'm just trying to understand in the presented uncertainty estimator capability. Can I just use it for hyperparameter uncertainty assessment rather than both hyperparameter and architecture?
Could you please expand that a little bit? So you want to, you want to only vary the hyperparameters and
exactly.
compute
create the ensembles based on the hyperparameter search, and then just stand alone to look into the hyperparameter uncertainty.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we have a sort of a supplementary method for that, in which we sort of run the hyperparameter search, okay, and select some, select top K configurations, hyperparameter configurations, and then fit a generative model. You will also see some of this in the transfer learning experiment. But this is a different work, but I'm happy to send you that that archive paper. So essentially the idea is to learn the joint distribution of the good hyperparameters, okay?
Exactly.
And we use that in two different ways. One is a straightforward way in which, okay, so we take the generative model and then sample more configurations, okay? More hyperparameter configurations, and evaluate them again. So in this case, we can build really high performing ensembles, right? So for example, you run the hyperparameter search and you select top 30 configurations, and then you can fit a generative model. So in this case, we use Gaussian coupler, and then from the Gaussian coupler, we sample more hyperparameter configurations, and then we use that hyperparameter configurations to train 50 model ensemble, okay? And then we use that ensemble to do the uncertainty quantification. And it turns out that that is like a lot more robust than just the 30 models that we use with the hyperparameter ensemble, the original one. We also have another way to do this, like, this is what is used in the transfer learning, where we do the hyperparameters, learn the joint probability distribution between these hyperparameters from the good configurations, and then use that to sort of do biased Bayesian optimization. So that is what you will see in the transfer learning experiment. But what you said is perfectly a valid strategy. Just do hyperparameter search, generate ensembles, and that is already better than dropout, for example, dropout type of techniques. Correct.
Okay. Do you mind sharing the archive paper that you mentioned?
Yes, I'm going to do that.
Thank you very much.
Tanvi, can you share, if you are here, can you share the paper with Aytekin?
Thank you.
The archive paper. If not, I will do that.
Thank you.
Great. Yes. Okay. Okay, so there is another question. Advantages of AutoDeck compared to approximations to full Bayesian approaches using variational inference, etc. Does AutoDeck outperform these? The answer is, typically the Bayesian approximation approaches, like the variational approaches, are computationally expensive. There are really interesting work that are happening here to address this problem on the scalability. So the Bayesian neural networks and variational inference approach that is sort of inherently based on Markov chain Monte Carlo, right? They have problem with scaling, and in fact, Sandeep, who is going to talk next, although he's not going to present that, he's working on some of these methods to scale this well. across different science problems. So the first and foremost thing, as Roman said, is the scalability issue. The training time for training the variation inference models are much higher, and they do not scale well for large models and for large data sets. Whereas if you look at the AutoDeck, it's completely parallel. So each model we are sort of training independently of the other models, right? It provides a lot of scalability, and then essentially we are sort of combining them to form ensembles, which in theory there are a lot of connections between ensemble models and the variational approaches. So our current experimental evidence in a couple of papers, we also compared these type of ensemble approaches to SGM CMC, the stochastic gradient Markov chain Monte Carlo, and we can do well with respect to both Eleatric, Epistemic, and in terms of training time and scalability as well. So yes, these type of ensemble approaches provide advantages with respect to these metrics. Having said that, there is also this issue of computational expense, right? So these models, like in a variation inference, you are training a single model, right? Whereas here we are training multiple models, which means that we need multiple GPUs and so on and so forth. So you have access to the resources. This is a fantastic approach. But if in a limited resource setting, probably deep ensembles will be a lot more computationally expensive. Let's say if you have a single GPU to train your model. Does that answer your question, Sumaga?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. This is a great set of questions. Alex has a question on how many models are needed in Ensemble to get a reasonable UQ? Is there a theoretical argument or bound? Is it a data set dependent? It is definitely data set dependent. But what the original deep ensemble paper from DeepMind, I think. That one. So essentially, they used like five member ensemble. So the deep ensemble, the classical paper on deep ensemble uses 5 ensemble, where they use the same model with the different random seeds and do this ensembling technique, if I understand correctly. It's really few. But then what we found out is it is certainly data set dependent, but anything in the range of like 5 to 10 is already providing better better uncertainty estimates than the variational approaches. Better in the sense, with respect to scalability, with respect to Eleatric and epistemic uncertainty, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple sort of advantages to even a smaller number of ensembles. We went up to the generative modeling approach that I mentioned with the previously. We went up to like 100 ensembles, and at some point of time, depending on the data set, adding ensembles doesn't improve the overall predictive accuracy. So it is definitely data dependent, but anything between 5 and 10 is already better than many of the existing variation inference approaches, which you can easily get. If you're running a hyperparameter search at a reasonable scale, you will be looking at, let's say, 500 models, right? Depending on the data set. I'm not talking about like, DALI type training, but reasonably sized data set. Probably 400 or 500 models, or even like 300 models. From that, you can easily select 5 to 10 using the greedy selection approach. Okay. Okay, so Gideon, you want to unmute yourself? Maybe I should ask people to unmute instead of me reading the question. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions.
Yeah, so my question is kind of way back when you parallelize DeepHyper and run on multiple GPUs. So I assume that the next optimal configuration depends on the previous one, because you add the previous one to the training set to predict the next one. So what you parallelize is just the different test points, right? The search space is what you run to. You send to different GPUs to get the best configuration for the next point, right?
If you're doing it sequentially, yes, but if you're doing it parallel, that's the whole point, right? So you cannot just send, okay, now with the current Bayesian model, I can just sample, instead of asking 1 from the model, you ask 4, right? If you have 4 GPUs, you cannot just ask 4 and continue the search, because that's the whole point of parallel Bayesian optimization. So you have to select the second one conditioned on the previous one without knowing the result of the previous one. In fact, you don't need to know the result of the previous one, right? Because you already sampled the previous one. I know that the result is going to come, okay? Conditioned on that, you select the second one. And then when you select the third one, you condition the third selection based on the first and second. Again, you don't need to know what is the accuracy of the first 2. All you need to know is, yeah, I sampled those 2. So I have to either stay away from those 2 regions, right? Or I have to somehow decide whether to focus on one region where you can, get a gold mine, right? So that is the whole point of doing parallel Bayesian optimization. So for example, in this case, we do, a liar strategy in which we take we tell the model that its prediction is right, and then retrain. What happens is, because of this retrain, we call it with the lie, the model uncertainty will become small, so that it will move away to a different region where you have where you have a different sort of uncertainty, and you can sample from there. So it's sort of diversifying the sampling rather than keep on sampling from the same space. And diversification need to be smart, and that's where the whole idea of the lying Kriging believer strategy comes in.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, there are a couple of other interesting questions which are useful for the broader audience as well. Maria, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that?
Yeah, sorry. So I was asking, the last question that I asked, you guys have been great, by the way, at answering. It was that, is DeepHyper right now outputting the best model after you do the hyperparameter optimization or the neural architectural search, and also the uncertainty, both at the same time?
Correct. So let's say the best model that you have, right? That model comes, let's say that's a trained model. So you checkpointed that best model, let's say, or an ensemble of models. Okay. So now you take that. So now you have an ensemble, let's say an ensemble of 5 models. Okay. Now that model, assuming that they are all trained during the search, right? You take those 5 models and store it, and then you use that for prediction. Okay. Now you give a new set of points to predict. It will, using those 5 ensembles, we can give you a predicted value. That the models will give you a prediction for the test point, like each point in the test data, and also uncertainty associated with each of the test point. And this uncertainty is decomposed into Eleatric uncertainty and epistemic uncertainty. So now, in a typical model, you give a test point, you get one predicted value. Now with the ensemble and the uncertainty, you give one test point, you will have predicted value, you have Eleatric uncertainty, and you have epistemic uncertainty. 3 values. Assuming that the predicted value is let's say a scalar. If it is a vector, for each of the values, we'll have an Eleatric, predicted value, Eleatric, and epistemic uncertainty.
Yeah, thank you. So you save all the models that are being evaluated, right? So it doesn't require a lot of memory, or is that any problem, or?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yes, it compared to single model, if you have 5 models in your ensemble, you are the memory, you need to have the memory for 5 models, right? So we cannot do it with trillion model parameters, an ensemble of, let's say, 10 trillion model parameters, right? But often, like these models are can be loaded and in the memory, and then we can do prediction. Okay, but then if you're talking about latency bound applications where you have to get the predictions in a much faster way, right? Because if you have 5 models, the prediction time is sort of increased, right? Of course, you can always parallelize. If you have 4 GPUs, send 4 models, keep the 4 models and 4 GPUs, and then send the prediction point to each one of them and get the prediction, right? So that's one way you can parallelize those models. But generally, the latency or the inference time with the ensemble will be much higher than a single model, right? Mm-hmm. And also the memory capacity will be higher than the single model. So this is a sort of a trade-off that one needs to decide whether if it is a latency specific or a latency sensitive application, then our inference time is really critical. Then we have to come up with a different type of method. So we have been thinking about doing having a single model that learns the uncertainty from the ensemble, right? So it's sort of an approximation, a single model approximation to the ensemble that we already have, right? Mm-hmm. That is a much sort of easier problem than learning the uncertainty from the data, right? So this is the idea of knowledge distillation or a student or a teacher-student type methodology, where you have a big model and you approximate that big model with a small model. So that's something that we have been thinking about, but we don't have that capability now. But this is something that we'll get this. We'll get it in DeepHyper.
Thank you.
Also, Prasanna, if I may add, I understood Maya was also asking during the search if it was taking a lot of space to save the models on the fly.
Oh, okay.
And I think if this was part of the question, I would answer yes. Saving model can take quickly a lot of space on the storage. So the idea is you do the search, you checkpoint the model, and then you directly apply Ensemble. And when you apply the Ensemble construction, it will select a subset of models. When these models are selected, you discard all other models that are checkpointed, and this reduces quickly the storage.
Yeah, this is during the training time. Okay. So Alfred also had a question on what is the theoretical justification for estimating uncertainty. Alfred, do you want to unmute yourself and can follow up?
Well, I think there were a lot of helpful comments about where to look to find the answers. I think that paper probably is the first thing I should do to get deeper insight into how you did it. So for me, intuitively speaking, it was a little bit hard for me to wrap my brain around the idea that you can still be able to say something about uncertainty when there's no data. But some of the comments you wrote in Slack were very helpful.
Okay, great. Happy to follow up, and we're happy to provide more info.
Yeah. I can add a little bit of a different perspective to it. So so the whole idea of uncertainty, because of DeepHyper's efficiency, can be thought of from a function space perspective. Think of it as in a function space, you first come to a class of functions, and then you search the best hyperparameter in that class of function, and then you search the best weight values for that particular class of functions. And all these things define how much your error in the approximation of whatever data you're approximating to is. So by doing DeepHyper, by doing NAS, you first set up the class of function within which you are going to search for a hyperparameter, and that will, by optimizing that layer, you will come up to a better approximation of whatever data you are trying to fit to from the perspective of what function space you're going to search in. Then by choosing the best hyperparameter, you narrow that error down a little bit more. And then by fitting the best weight parameter, you narrow that error down a little bit more. And now when you do this step for multiple times, like multiple steps, you get an estimate of this error by each of these combinations. And then an average estimate of these errors is an uncertainty because of that approximation. So this is another perspective to think about it, is that from a function approximation perspective, it gives me an estimate of both the function approximation error and the generalization error, as well as the training or the validation error from what you are training on. So a combination of these three gives me an uncertainty, which is an epistemic uncertainty in that case. A combination of the while just the training validation error gives me an error on Eleatric uncertainty, which is on the data itself. So the reason without any data you can get an estimate of uncertainty is because you are summarizing, in a sense, an estimate of generalization error from a function approximation error. This is a completely different side of thinking about it, but this is another way you can visualize it, if that made any sense.
Another simple example could be, this the setting where you let the group of blind men and go and touch an elephant and ask them what describe the elephant, right? So if you make all the person like tie their eyes, each one of them will come up with different explanation, right? Different description, and that is the sort of the epistemic uncertainty, right? So they were not trained, or they don't know what they are, because their eyes are blindfolded, right? So their answers will be completely different, right? As soon as, let's say, you give a little bit of light in the dark room and remove their blind fold, then just add a little bit of light there, right? So now they can see the structure, the overall structure somehow, and then they will start converging to the same result, right? So that's why when you have the data, all the models will sort of say something similar. When you don't have the data, these models are going to give you a completely different results. So when you look at the variance of the different results, that will be high. So that's where you have the high epistemic uncertainty.
Using that analogy, so somebody is touching the elephant's tails and the elephant's ears, and somehow you want to say something about how certain you are about the middle of the elephant. What does it really look like, right?
Yeah. So okay. So this is correct. So let's say we expose well, in this case we are giving the training data to so the elephant is a whole training data, and ear is a part of the training data to one model, and the tail is part of the training data given to another model. And then if you ensemble them and ask like, oh, what is the middle of the elephant, these models are not going to say anything. And the model that saw only tail will say, oh, this looks like a fat tail. And the model that saw only the ears, they'll say, oh, this looks like a much more stronger ear, right? And then you take an average, like, oh, stronger tail and stronger ear. It has no sort of correlation, and that's where the large epistemic uncertainty will kick in.
Right, the ear and the tail is not going to tell you anything about the legs, right?
Exactly. And the model that saw ear will say that, oh, this ear is like not anymore soft or like flexible, but it's a lot more stronger ear. Whereas this the model that saw tail will say, oh, this is like really a fat tail. So, and then you combine these results, this is okay, this is like huge difference, and that's exactly the epistemic uncertainty.
Okay, all right, thanks. I have a better idea now.
Got you. Great. Okay, so there is a question on how do we separate Eleatric and epistemic uncertainties when using ensemble methods? Fantastic question. So I shared a paper, and we use the law of total variance to tease out. So we first compute the total uncertainty and then tease out the Eleatric and epistemic uncertainty. So if you think about, so a simple explanation is, let's say each model has a mean and a variance, right? Each model in the ensemble has a mean and variance. The epistemic uncertainty is nothing but the variance of the mean. Okay, so how much the mean across the models differ, right? That is the epistemic uncertainty. And the Eleatric uncertainty is the mean of the variance, okay? Which is nothing but, okay, each model has a variance, and I'm just looking at the mean of the whole variance. That gives you, so the variance of each model comes from the data uncertainty, right? Each model has a data uncertainty, and then the mean of the whole data uncertainty is my total Eleatric uncertainty. So the simple explanation is a variance of the mean is epistemic, and the mean of the variance is Eleatric, and that is a nice nice theory that one can come up with to explain this. That's in the paper. If you can Slack, if you can put this question in the Slack, I can follow up with the paper URL.